Hello, and welcome to Wired for Wellbeing, a podcast devoted to viewing our lives through a nervous system perspective to better understand what's actually going on and how to shift it. Because we are inherently wired for well-being, we all hold the keys to connection, happiness, and ease. I'm Dr. Jeffrey Rutstein, clinical psychologist who specializes in the treatment of trauma, dissociation, and chronic illness and pain for over 40 years. In this podcast, we listen to real questions and challenges from people just like you and offer guidance, perspective, and a way through. I'm joined by my good friend and producer, Steve Lessard. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Jeffrey. How are you today?
I'm very well. Glad you're here. Today's theme is centered around discernment, discerning when to share what we know, and how to discern nervous system information about our past versus information about the present moment. In this episode, we'll explore how tuning into these signals can bring clarity, heal old patterns, and lead us towards a lighter and easier way of being. Through this process, you may find what might shift for you within this awareness. Steve, what calls do you have for us this week?
Well, Jeffrey, let's get right into Catherine's question. Catherine is asking about intergenerational trauma and how do we know when's the right time to share that information?
Hello, Dr. Rutstein. My name is Catherine. Learning my family history of trauma experienced by prior generations has been an important part of my own healing of childhood trauma. Would you please discuss how, if, and when it's appropriate to share this history of trauma with the generations following mine, especially those who are still being impacted by it? Thank you.
Well, Catherine, that's a great question, and it's an important one. Because, as you mentioned, for many of us, understanding the legacy within our family lineage of trauma that previous generations experienced has a lot to do with us understanding the impacts on our nervous system, and the way that we sort of walk through life is often shaped by this often hidden history of familial transgenerational trauma. So I really applaud that you were able to explore some of that and found that to be helpful in your own healing journey. One of the questions I often get is something around this line: when is it appropriate? When is it okay and helpful to share the information? And I first want to take a little sidetrack and say, sometimes we're drawn to share information because we really feel that it'll be helpful and beneficial to the other person. Sometimes we may also want to do it in addition to wanting to be helpful because we can't stand to see them suffering. So we want to help pull them out of suffering as quick as possible by helping them get some history or background so that they could have a different perspective. Why I'm talking about these things is because I'd really like to encourage people to be very honest with yourself about what's motivating this, what's the agenda for sharing it. If it's about getting someone to be or feel differently, I'd advise that you pull back on it, because you're going to be telling them the information with the idea that this is going to help propel them in a certain direction. And number one, we don't have the capacity to direct people to how to follow or how to process information we offer them. But the other thing is their nervous system may not be ready or curious about learning this aspect of their family history. So the first thing is to check in with your own agenda to see if it feels like it's just sharing from the heart, or if there's a little bit of pressure or desire to change the trajectory of where they are. And then I would also ask, in my own healing, I found that understanding a little bit of our family's trauma history gave me a perspective on why I encounter some of the difficulties I do in living. If they're interested and they want to hear more, that's great. But if they don't seem interested, I wouldn't push it. Because if you're pushing information on anyone, they're not going to receive it. Chances are it'll dysregulate them, and they won't know what to do with it. If, on the other hand, they show a curiosity or openness, well, I'd like to hear if you'd like to tell me, that's fine. So it really is about, there's no objective right time to share this. And it can be at all different ages and stages that you share. And you may also discern whether you need to share everything in that conversation or whether you'll share things in piecemeal or a part of your history that's very directly related to a struggle that you see them having right now. In other words, you don't have to overwhelm them with information. Just like you probably didn't learn it all at once. It was over time you put this together. Other people and their nervous systems need time for this to process. So I really appreciate your sensitivity to wanting to offer what you found beneficial and offer this to ease some of the suffering of these other generations who, of course, are still impacted by intergenerational trauma, whether they know about it or not. If there's trauma in the family line, it will affect us nervous system-wise in one way or another. So that's a really good awareness that you have. I would just now invite you to kind of also begin to tune into their nervous systems. And you're not going to expect it to read it absolutely, but to ask them then, are you interested in learning about this? Would you think this would be helpful if I shared this? And that's an invitation versus kind of just going in there and releasing the information.
I think it might be helpful, particularly for our friends who this idea of intergenerational trauma is a new idea, to maybe share what that is. And I find some of the research, the implications of some of the research really fascinating. So I wonder if you could go into a little bit just about what intergenerational trauma is. I realize this might not relate to Catherine's question specifically, but to unpack it for people who are just scratching their heads a little bit.
Absolutely. That's a great question. Yeah. So what we mean by intergenerational trauma is interesting experiment in the 70s that were done with lab rats or lab mice that back then, when we did experiments, we would sometimes use shock boards, which were these little areas of confinement for mice or rats. And the grating on the floor would be composed of little wires in like a pattern, a checkerboard pattern. And is when on command, the experimenter could send a shock to the floor of the containment area that the mice or rat is in and would cause them to convulse from the shock. And then what they did is they paired a stimulus to that shock. So they took a cotton ball soaked in some fragrance, either magnolia, I think it was magnolia, or cherry blossom, and exposed the animals to that, and then immediately upon exposure also sent a shock through the shock floor. So the experimental animals would smell and inhale the scent and receive a shock. And after pairing this over many trials together, all they needed to do was then present the cotton ball soaked in that scent, and without any electric shock whatsoever, just the scent, because it had been paired with the shock, the animals immediately went into spasms and seizures. So then they stopped because they had achieved the learning they wanted to see. And they waited 5 generations of rats to descend. And in rat and mice life, that's just a few months for each generation. So within a year and a half, they had gone 5 generations since the trained generation of great-great-grandparents. They took these children out, they placed them in a containment area, no shockboard. They presented them with this stimulus, the scented piece of cotton. And the children, the 5th generation of children, would immediately go into seizure spasms. So that was the first, and we've had many studies since then that show that there are genetic changes in the way that our nervous system reacts that can be passed down, at least in the mice realm, 5 generations of descendants. And there was no more training. In other words, all the following generations from the great-great-grandparents, none of them received any training in the pairing the shock with the scent. So for 4 generations, 5 generations, it was never applied at all. And then in this 5th generation, they presented the stimulus and it reignited this learning. We know that very similar things happen in the nervous systems of humans. For humans, our first big study of this was with all the first generation after, called OGA, one generation after the Holocaust. The children of Holocaust survivors had many, many symptoms of PTSD, even though many of their parents never spoke about the trauma. Matter of fact, most families, it was too overwhelming to talk about, so it was never spoken. There was something that was genetically passed to the children, and children in general, for one generation after, have higher stress-related diseases, tended to be more anxious, more dysregulated more of the time, more reactive. And again, so these symptoms that show up in a following generation are what's the proof of this idea of intergenerational, transgenerational trauma. So if you've had trauma yourself, you have trauma in your own life. But if in addition to that, your parents had trauma, your mother, your father, your great-great-grandparents did, that there's a chance also that this is also loading your nervous system with trauma. And even if you had no trauma, if your grandparents did, or your mother or father did, then there's a good chance your nervous system is already going to be more slated or slanted towards being dysregulated, towards being overreactive. So that's what we're meaning about intergenerational trauma, is that it is the passing down of the genetic learning and responding and adaptation to traumatic stress that gets passed down to us. And even without going through a trauma ourselves, our nervous system is tuned up as if we did go through it.
The implications of that just continue to blow my mind, and I think really start to widen the lens of what we're experiencing and what we're not only inheriting, but what we're passing on. And I think it's great that Catherine has this awareness that perhaps it's time to start to share some of this information with her family. And I loved your advice on check in on your motivation. What a powerful way to start this process. But maybe there's another side of it also of, is there a way to kind of determine, is this person safe? I might have the right motivation, but is this person safe to share this information with?
In particular, tell me a little bit more about what you were thinking about whether or not the person would be safe.
Whether they'd fully be able to receive it, whether they'd be able to not be triggered and dysregulated by you bringing up this information to them that their past behavior may be affecting you, or their parents' past behavior. Someone who's I guess dysregulated in you sharing that information with them.
It may make them feel unsafe. And again, I want to differentiate the difference between our nervous system feeling or sensing that something's unsafe and something being actually unsafe. I don't think it's actually unsafe to give people information about their past. I don't think it'll actually harm them. If people aren't ready to hear it, they just won't hear it. They'll get angry at the messenger, deny it, minimize it, or turn it around. And so if you say it to someone who then gets defensively activated, they could attack the speaker. Or you're saying, you don't know what you're talking about, or just because you're messed up, don't think that I'm messed up. It could go 1,000 different ways. But I think that if we tell someone something that they're not prepared to hear, they're going to feel both uncomfortable and threatened. And that's going to break the connection, right? Like if I feel uncomfortable or threatened, I'm going to step back from being as connected with you because I'm going to feel like I need to protect myself. And my sense is Catherine wants to do this out of love. She wants to do this to increase her felt connection with family and also try to help them live less in the shadow of their family's trauma, to actually find a way towards their true self, their untraumatized self. So I think that your question about safety is an important one, but I think that ultimately, if someone's also attuned, we'll be paying attention when we're saying something to somebody. So somebody says, yeah, I'd like to hear about that. And I start to say, well, when your dad was such and such, this happened. And then you see the person's face go blank and shocked, and they look like they're holding their breath and not breathing. That would be a signal to stop sharing. That would be a signal to go, okay. Like, I hear you want this, but whoa, I get a sense that this is big for you. Let's just stop here. Right? You just wouldn't keep going. Oh, well, let me tell you about the other 70 things I know, and just make you feel like you have to like leave this room screaming. There's no reason to do that.
Yeah, thanks for helping to unpack that idea of safety a little bit. I can see how I was kind of putting a couple things together. So thank you for articulating that difference. I want to switch gears now and get to another question that we've received, this one from Dory. And Dory is looking for advice on how to decipher the information that they're receiving. Let's take a listen to Dory's question.
Great.
Hello, Jeffrey. Dory here. I sometimes have difficulties discerning the difference between messages from the stuff of daily life that simply needs to be attended to, and a subtler, inchoate feeling of responsibility that seems to rise up from deep inside me. While I sometimes dread the daily life tasks, I think I'm beginning to tune into another deeper kind of dread that lurks cell deep. Is my feeling of this other darker dread a reliable attunement? Thank you. Bye.
Wow. Dory, that is a great and nuanced question. So, Dory, it seems like you've been practicing a good deal along this path of trying to work with and understand your nervous system. So I want to really commend you for that, because that takes a bit of commitment to self-care and courage to persevere. You're talking here about picking up and noticing subtle nervous system feedback. So, you're calling receiving messages, which is noticing what you're feeling. And those feelings are our messages that our nervous system is sending us about how we're feeling about a task at hand. So that you're noticing that there is a resistance you might feel, right? About like, oh, I don't feel like doing this or doing that obligation today. And that's a little bit of nervous system feedback right there, because our nervous system is telling us, right, not who we are or how we are, but it's telling us how we're feeling, how we're doing. And so if you get up in the morning and go, I don't feel like going to that social obligation today, well, most likely that lets us know that either you really don't like spending time with these people, that could be an objective truth, or that you're in a state of kind of shutdown and collapse, that lower energy place. And from there, we don't feel like doing anything. So if I was kind of in that shutdown place and was looking at activities for the day, I would feel like I don't want to. They feel outside of my realm of energy. So it's picking up that subtle nervous system information loop. Now, it could be that within an hour or 2 hours, your mood and state will change, as it does for many of us. You might find that later in the day, you don't have the resistance to that activity anymore, and you just do it. But you're differentiating that from a kind of deeper, more widespread, non-specific feeling of dread that feels like it lurks cell deep. Now, that's also nervous system information. But what you're noticing is that the first level of resistance comes up to specific activities or behaviors in life, daily tasks. And then there is this different feeling. It's subtler, but more pervasive. And you notice that it seems to rise up deep inside of you versus coming in from the outside. And that there is this almost ever-present, deeper, darker dread. So if you're picking this up, it's reliable. It's a reliable attunement. You are picking up on something that's also there, and you're beginning to ask important questions about the differentiating of these two slightly but importantly different experiences. So our going in and out of states is dictated by many things: our energy level, our health level, the level of stress we feel, how comfortable we feel, how safe we feel. And that's going to impact a lot of our moment-to-moment shifts in our nervous system. But if we're a trauma survivor, or if we've grown up in families that have a lot of adversity or criticism or shaming and blaming if the children didn't do right, didn't do well enough, then that's going to instill this kind of abiding sense of dread, either about waiting for bad things to happen, or feeling that somehow you still may identify with just not being up for meeting the day, up for meeting your life, having enough resilience or strength or follow through to be in your life, or more afraid that you don't really feel safe in this part of the nervous system. There's safety, but there's this dread that something bad could happen. So I begin to get curious about that background dread. And a piece of advice here that you hear me say often is do your best not to lean into being critical and judgmental when you feel into this background sense of dread, because that's one place we can go, is blaming ourselves for this. Instead of closing down into judgment, see if you can stay open to being curious and feeling into it as best you can about what's the message here? What feels unsafe? What am I protecting myself from? And to do that, it also helps to begin to listen to the narrative that your head may be playing during these moments. We can sometimes, if we pay attention to the narrative or the narration that's going on in our mind, by paying attention to the kinds of words and tones that it's using, we can tune directly into our state. If your state inside, if the voice is critical and harsh and demeaning, well, you're in a collapse and shutdown state, and you're kind of drowning in a sense of agitated shame. So listening with some curiosity to the inner voice will give you more detail when you're in these spaces about what the message is. But in my experience, I have found that the more pervasive nervous system senses we have, like always feeling ashamed, or always feeling on edge, or never feeling like it's safe to relax, or just this unformed or non-directed sense of dread, that these more pervasive states are actually pointers at our past, that they speak about what our nervous system had to do to accommodate or manage our own past, especially if there was adversity or trauma. I hope this is helpful, Dory.
Jeffrey, as I'm understanding Dory's question and your response to Dory, it seems like Dory's done a little bit of work in their healing journey and might have a slightly different perspective than someone new to this work, and is therefore then seeing a slightly different landscape, maybe like the mountains a little bit further away, to use that analogy. And I'm wondering, like, how does that awareness change, not only for someone maybe beginning of the process, but in Dory's position where they've got that perspective, what does this growing awareness look like over time, or how does it shift? How does it shift?
So part of what happens when we learn to embody a nervous system perspective, not just to understand it. Understanding it's helpful, don't get me wrong, but its real power comes from when we can embody this way of being with our own nervous system. It changes and deepens and grows. And what happens is we become more able and more comfortable just noticing where we are, just simply noticing our state. And beginning, instead of to use that as a jumping off point for beating ourselves up, to just use that as to locate where we are on this nervous system map, as I call it. Because once you know where you are, then it becomes clear where you'd like to go and how to shift to get there. So at first, we tune to the body and the nervous system, and over time, we begin to get familiar with when I'm in flight. I feel my eyes darting around and my chest and throat tightening up, and I feel kind of fidgety and like I gotta move. When I feel ashamed, I kind of feel collapsed and kind of hollowed out here and a little bit afraid, but really kind of withdrawing from life. So we can begin to name and notice these more dramatic shifts in the nervous system. As we continue to practice, we begin to notice the more and more subtle shifts, because they're also occurring, but at first we may not notice the more subtle shifts. We may only notice the much more dramatic or graphic or strongly emotional ones. And as we develop this sensitivity to listening to and interpreting our nervous system, we begin to find that the relationship deepens. We become more familiar with our mind and our nervous system in a way we never had before, and we actually find ways to work with it. So Dory has been aware of her own resistance or struggles or burden with maybe some tasks of daily life, but she's now also becoming aware of this other, even more subtle background dread that can ride on top of or with the daily task dread, but perhaps has a life of its own. And it does, meaning it was given life in the past. So this is not saying anything is broken in Dory. Her nervous system is working perfectly fine. She's become attuned and sensitive enough to be able to begin to hear these more subtle messages. And that's just a sign that we're moving in closer to have a better relationship as an ally to our nervous system versus an adversary to our nervous system.
The phrase that's come to me a few times out of our discussion here, the question that Dory brought up, as well as us talking about intergenerational trauma, is the phrase, "Is this mine?" And maybe that's not the best way to phrase it, because maybe it is in some ways all ours, but it seems like sometimes it might not be. Maybe we don't have to identify with it, or I don't know, maybe you can help refine my thinking around that idea, but there feels like there's something potentially liberating in that piece.
I think that there's something profoundly liberating about moving from a psychology-based perspective to a nervous system-based perspective. Most psychotherapies for years have identified pathologies, what's wrong with us, right? A nervous system perspective doesn't pathologize. You have a nervous system that's been trained, and it's either been trained to be regulated or it's trained to be dysregulated. But the great news is anybody can learn how to regulate, self-regulate their nervous system. Given time and interest, you can do that. So part of it is noticing, right, that it's not me, it's my nervous system. Because a lot of times we'll just jump in and go, what's wrong with me that I'm so anxious or can't relax and we're so socially awkward? Instead of, wow, my nervous system doesn't feel safe in these situations. I wonder what I can do to help myself feel safer and more connected, not less connected. When we sort of see this as a possibility, we can extend it then also to intergenerational trauma. So, for example, let's make up a case with Dory that she didn't have trauma in her immediate family, but her grandparents or great-grandparents may have felt literally traumatized about needing to survive, or that there was darkness or danger for them culturally or illness-wise or societally at that time. And so there's also a chance that Dory's dread, if she didn't have trauma herself, may be coming intergenerationally. It may not really be just her issue. It may be something that she inherited. And first she can locate it still in her own experience about what is fueling or behind this dread, what is she dreading? And as she gets in touch with that, she can also begin to release it. And that's part of how we can also begin to release intergenerational trauma. Our first caller, Catherine, was talking about how that was indeed liberating for her, to see that she wasn't just traumatized herself, but that the family has had trauma and that this has impacted her growing up in so many ways, in addition to whatever hardship she experienced herself. So our freedom and our liberation can come from being able to see space to move towards that which is bothering us, to be with it compassionately, and to find a route towards shifting to a more comfortable, more engaged and connected state of regulation. Instead of, I'm broken, I'm bad, and there's nothing that can fix me, which is what our psychology, our beliefs will often tell us, and that's just not the truth. How does that land in you, Steve?
Yeah, that's a lot clearer, because there was something not quite right in my mind about how I set that and phrased that. But that definition, I think, gets to the root of what I was looking for.
Great.
It's very powerful. And I've seen that, and I'm sure you've seen that numerous times. I've seen people come to that realization, and it's almost like a weight. It gets removed from their shoulders. It's fascinating to see.
Yeah.
What are some takeaways that we might start to leave our audience with around these two themes that we were looking at today?
Well, first of all, our first questioner sort of brings up a point that we may not always emphasize in here, and that's that in addition to her doing work with her nervous system and with learning how to find her way back to self-regulation, she's also finding that understanding her family's history is helpful in having a more compassionate understanding for why she suffers and struggles with the things that she suffers and struggles with. And her desire to reduce the time that these other family members spend suffering comes also, at least in part, if not in whole, from a heart that wants to love and support others and reduce their pain. And what we brought up in that is that she might be ready to share it, and it has been healing for her, but she needs to get in touch with, as best she can, her full and true motivations or agenda for this, and also as best she can to sense, see, and ask if these family members are open or interested or desiring to have this information shared with them. And if they do, that's great. But if they don't, that needs to be respected. So part of this is decide based on where our nervous system is and if it's ready to share, and also are others' nervous systems who we'd like to share this with, are they ready to receive it? In our second question from Dory, we sort of also have a pointing out of what can be easily found in ourselves with just some continued practice, which is that we really can get to know our nervous system. And instead of being blindsided, why am I so upset? Why am I so down right now? Why am I so angry? We begin to see that these flows aren't just happenstance. There's things that occur inside us or inside of a personal relationship with or in the world and between us Any of those three things can trigger this sense of feeling unsafe, and then we go into a defensive state. So by paying more and more attention to what may lead us into dread, which is a type of shutdown, then we can find ways to relate to it instead of being imprisoned by it. So the deeper we go in understanding a nervous system perspective, the more that we move towards a kind of freedom and liberation for ourselves and others about keeping in these reactive, stuck patterns.
Well, I want to thank our callers for sending in their amazing questions. And Jeffrey, maybe you can tell our friends how to send in a question and how to learn a little bit more about this work that you're putting out into the world.
Those were great calls. If you'd like to send a question, feel free to call 866-357-5156. That's 866-357-5156. Or for any reason you can't reach the 866 exchange, please feel free to send an audio recording. And if you can't do that, you can just write an email and send it to hello@drjeffreyrutstein.com. That's hello@drjeffreyrutstein.com. And if you're interested in a free gift, check out the one I have for you on my website that offers a little bit more understanding and some practices about nervous system regulation. And you can go there. The address is drjeffreyrutstein.com/free gift. That's drjeffreyrutstein.com/free gift. If you enjoyed this and you'd like to help us out, please tell a friend. Share with them. Steve, thank you so much as always for your participation in these conversations. I love the way that we can sort of go deep and wide.
I agree. It's always a pleasure. Thank you, Jeffrey.
And thank all of you for joining us today. I hope to see you next time. Bye for now.